Hi, peace be upon you folks. Today I'd like to talk about Sharia and Jihad or Sharia in Jihad. So some of the laws and guidelines uh, when partaking in Jihad. And I'm using Jihad as an armed struggle. And along the way, I would talk about the punishment for apostates because I believe this also has to do with Jihad. I had talked about, I had made an introduction to Sharia, Jihad, and Caliphate in another talk. So I wouldn't go too much into what Jihad really is, but I'd just like to make clear that Jihad is not a war or an armed struggle in order to get people to convert to Islam. I'd made this clear already that um, the Quran itself, it says that there's no compulsion in the acceptance of the religion. So jihad is in order to establish truth and justice. It's in order to fight oppression. It's in order to defend yourself. So any armed struggle that establishes truth or establishes justice or fights against injustice and fights in the way of establishing the religion of God and establishing it on the land, that's part of the armed struggle in jihad. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is not the only prophet that fought jihad. Uh, Many other prophets fought jihad. Moses fought jihad, Solomon fought jihad, and his father David fought jihad, and the Messiah himself, Jesus, the son of Mary. In his return, he would fight jihad. He would fight against the Dajjal, the liar, the one who's known as the Antichrist. So, jihad is part of the way of God sometimes. And just because somebody says they perform in jihad doesn't mean they are. For example, some groups, because of the injustices that have been done to their nations from the West, and the West has been enslaving and colonizing the people in different ways uh, for a long time now. Uh, so sometimes there's a resistance, just like you have rebellions in places. So these people can use the name of Islam, and because maybe they want to get a wider support, but sometimes it's just a rebellion, and the ways they utilize the jihad or the way they engage in jihad is not the way that's necessarily allowed in Islam. So I'll talk about the Sharia in jihad, the regulations in jihad, and try to clear up some of the misconceptions and some of the willful lies that people spread online and in the media. Um, there was a recent documentary that came out talking about, I think it was titled Why They Hate Us by Farid Zakaria. Uh, and I would like to point out that just because something is a documentary doesn't mean it addresses the issue unbiasedly. You know, uh, whenever there's a documentary, somebody's paying for that documentary. So you have to look at that and look at what's the opinion that that person who's paying it for, what stance do they take as with relation to that issue. So there's going to be probably a bias towards that issue because somebody's sponsoring it. It's like some of the research that happens in some of these countries. You know, the people pay for the research, and they don't come out and say it, or sometimes they do, but basically they pay so that certain results are achieved. And the people who do the research try to bring up these results because people are paying for this research, basically. So just because something is a documentary doesn't mean you're getting the whole truth from it. And also beware of some of these Muslims that are interviewed in the Western media. You know, sometimes you look at it and you say, oh, they call them Muslim, and you think they speak for all the Muslims. But there are a lot of deviating sects. There are a lot of sects that basically don't carry the beliefs of Islam. They would like to think they do, I think, and they convince people and they convince themselves that they do. But just like the time of the Prophet, they were hypocrites. All right. So you have these sects that have been created by people who wanted to, as they say, reform Islam instead of reforming their own lives, uh, and let Islam perfect it. They want to reform Islam to their desires, towards something that's more suitable to the West, basically. So beware of these people who are interviewed. Google them if you can and see what sects they belong to and what beliefs they hold. And don't just take their word for it. Because the fact that because the media is owned by a few group of people, all right? And these people are not believing people. And these people have certain opinions, and maybe even some of them are maybe even anti-theist. You never know. These are atheists who like believe like religion should be abolished even by force. These are what they call the anti-theists. So beware of some of these Muslims that they decide to call to interview on their media. And I had said in that same talk about Sharia, the Jihad, and Caliphate that Sharia is just law, and Islamic Sharia, Islamic law, is based on acknowledging the sovereignty of God, acknowledging that He is the Creator and He is the Lord, He is our Master. So when He gives us a law, once you've seen the book, you've read the Quran, you've read His revelation, and you've come to the conclusion that this is the truth, and truth is better than falsehood. So once you've come to that conclusion that this is the truth, then you submit. And once you've submitted, maybe God puts faith in your heart and grows that faith for you. But once you've done that, you have to submit to what the commands are, because you believe this is the truth and this is what Islam is. Once you submit to the will of God, and all the prophets did that, they didn't submit to their desires. And so even if some punishments seem harsh, and I said this before, punishment is not supposed to be appealing, all right? But the West and their secular ideas, their law, basically it's a civil religion, and their laws are based on secular ideals. So they'll try to say things like, "Oh, this is such a harsh punishment, like stoning to death," which is in the Bible, actually. So but many Christians, they've left most of what's in the Bible. They just acknowledge their faith by words, and that's well, some of the Christians. Let me not say many, because some people might be a little offended by that. But sometimes you have to look at the truth and not just try to be offended and be defensive. And even if you're a Christian who believes that Jesus abolished the laws of the Torah, the laws of Moses, then at least you acknowledge that at some point, or if you believe that these laws are not in the gospel, at least you believe that at some point God had prescribed those laws for the children of Jacob, the children of Israel. So, was God unjust then? And God is never unjust, and He's merciful. So, if you are not more merciful than God, and you are not more just than God, and God created hell as well as heaven. So, and you see some ignorant people saying the God in the Old Testament is this and that, and they think it's a different God. It's not a different God. When you look at it in perspective, you see that God had shown these people so many of His greatest signs that they should believe, and yet still some of them took up idols and worshipped it. And that's one of the biggest sins in front of God, that you should worship anything other than Him, the single Creator, the absolute, the indivisible, and decide to say, this is part of God, this is part of God, and these people have some kind of divinity, these people have nearness to God and saints, and you pray to them. No. But, all that is another issue for some other time, and some Christian sects have, they do this without even contemplating much about it, when they create these images and they pray to saints, and So the idea is God has never been unjust, all right? And God has never been different. God is unchangeable. So if He had suggested that punishment before, and He was never unjust, then, don't listen to the disbelievers when they try to speak ignorantly against some of the laws of God because basically they don't believe and they don't want you to believe. They don't want you to follow the commands of God. So the punishment is not supposed to be appealing. All right. The punishment is supposed to deter. You're supposed to be fearful of it, and it's supposed to deter what God doesn't like. And the disbelievers and the secular people will say, "Oh, people allow stoning to death just for eloping or having sexual intercourse with the wrong person." No, it's not about having sexual intercourse with the wrong person. It's about having sexual intercourse while you're married. All right, that's adultery. There's fornication, but adultery is while you're married, you have sexual intercourse with another person. All right, so it's not just the wrong person. All right, so and that's a grave act in the sight of God. So why is it that the secular people don't talk about the immorality of such acts, but then they talk about the punishments of such acts? Because the truth is, what they want to deal with is heedlessness. That's what they want. They don't care about laws, and they don't. And when they make these statements, people have to read between the lines and realize that they're basically striving against the word of God. They're basically striving against his commands. So basically, they're striving against whatever religion is preaching those commands, even though they don't come out right and say it. So they want you to change those laws, all right, and so that it's more compatible and more to their liking. And that's not what it should be in Islam. They've reformed Christianity and now they want to reform Islam. And like I said, they've enslaved, they've colonized, and they're still colonizing in a way, whether it's by the International Monetary Fund and how they keep you in bonds of debt, or their continuous invasion and their stealing of your resources. There are many ways they keep you colonized. And look at how many armies they have around the world. And even if you Google, you can see some of the images of some of the French or the Belgians when they came into Africa, in Congo, Algeria, how they treated the women, the men, the children. Look at some of these images and see them for the savages, for what they are. And then they come out and ask why they hate us. Well, maybe if you stop bombing them and killing their parents and their loved ones, they wouldn't hate you. All right? Yes, Islamic ideals are against secular beliefs, and that should be for every religion because secular beliefs go to heedlessness. The one thing secular people don't go against is taking life because obviously they want their life. They want to make a name for themselves in this life. They want to leave a mark in history because they don't have anything else to look forward to. They don't believe in the hereafter. So this is all they want their life to be, and this is what they want everybody's life to be, so that you strive only for this life. But I've spent a lot of time on, going around the subject. So let's let's jump into the subject. Now, as I said, jihad is not about converting people to Islam. All right, and I see jihad as Islamic activism. So an Islamist is one who's an activist for Islam, who tries to reform society so that it abides by the laws of Islam, which is a good thing. Because if you believe in God, then He ought to be obeyed more than anybody else in the earth. You can't obey somebody else when it goes against God's laws. That means you've taken that person as your God. So an Islamist, I've said before, is not a bad thing. Every Muslim should be an Islamist. But how you go about this jihad is what the issue is. You have some of these groups like Taliban, uh, Al Qaeda, ISIS, and they say they want to establish an Islamic government that follows the Sharia of Islam, which is a good thing. But how they go about this jihad, most of the time, that's where uh, the disagreement comes. Because you can't, for example, do suicide bombing because suicide is not accepted. They found ways to, you know, accept this and allow this. But basically, you can't do that. And you can't burn people. You can't kill people by burning because fire is the punishment of God, basically. You can't punish somebody by fire. And you can't kill people for what they believe in. All right, so you can't just kill people because they're Christians or because they're just non-Muslims. And You can't kill people indiscriminately, which everybody does. The West does it with their carpet bombing. But Muslims should not do that. So you can't just go to a place and kill the guilty as well as the innocent, the people who don't take up arms to fight against you. In fact, the people who fight against you are the lawmakers. And if you're going to fight the enemy, fight them up front. All right? And kill those who take up arms to fight against you, those who are in their armies and all that. And you have to be smart, because if you fight in a jihad, then you have to look at what the end goal is. So if you're an activist, you start by preaching. In Islam, they call that dawah, preaching Islam, letting people realize the truth in Islam. Let your strength grow. The prophets preached for years before God allowed them to fight. Right? So let your strength grow, because everything is about, it's God who guides and it's God who gives strength. And you have to use your intellect. You have to use your senses. You can't just start fighting, without first following some rules. So try to do it by peaceful means. And if you meet retaliation and they start maybe like taking out your leaders, maybe there will be reason for you to take up arms and fight. And when you take up arms, do it in the right way. You fight in the way that is allowed within the law of Islam. So it's good to start with dawah, by preaching Islam and preaching why people should follow the Sharia, and getting people to transform their lives, transform society, reform society, and bring back Islam. Because there can be Muslims in a place, but there can be no Islam. But if you look at the way some of these groups do what they call jihad, and you look at the end goal and what they're trying to achieve, then you realize it's not even jihad. Because if you're doing acts like suicide bombing and you're killing people indiscriminately, then first of all, you're creating hatred towards Islam. You're helping the disbelievers against Islam. So what's your end goal? For example, if you have to come up with intelligent ways to do it. There can be sanctions. Most of the Muslim countries have the oil. You can prevent the oil from those who oppress Muslims and those who ally themselves with oppressors. For example, the United States is allied with Israel, and Israel oppresses the Muslims. But you have some of the Arab and Muslim countries, they're allied with Israel. It doesn't make any sense. So, there are ways you have to go about jihad, and it has to make sense. Now, talking about the subject of allying yourself, being allies with somebody. Allah says in the Quran that, you should not take ally with the disbelievers. But when you look at the Quran, here's what you have to understand. God says in Surah Iman, it says, in the Quran, there are verses that are clear, and there are verses not so clear. So maybe like analogous verses, figurative verses. The clear verses are the foundation of the book. And it says, those who have disease in their heart, those who have dissension, they might interpret those unclear verses to fit their goals, But it says the clear verses are the foundations of the book. So a lot of the time people use the verses that are not so clear for their own purposes. And people should understand that. That's one. Secondly, the Quran doesn't go against itself. It's clear, all right? God himself says it in the Quran that if you contemplate on the Quran, you will realize it's from God, because there are no contradictions. So obviously there are no clear contradictions in the Quran. But sometimes you read a verse and you think it goes against another verse. In a way, not directly, but in a way. I'll give you an example. In one part of the Quran, it says, in the day of judgment, the disbelievers, those who are bound to hell, they will be given their record, basically their record of good and bad, in their left hand. In another part of the Quran, it says they will be given their record behind their backs. Now, if you put the two together, all right, it can either be that some will be given in their right hand, in their left hand, and others will be given from behind their back, but in their left hand behind their back. And there's this explanation as well, which I heard the other time. It says, so, for example, when they see that the people of hell see that the people of hell, their record is being given to them in their right hand, in their left hand, they're going to try to hide their hands behind their backs, so that they don't get their record. But it's like the records will be flying all in the air and coming to the people, just like a soul finds, your body, like some antenna and some radio receiver. So they would receive their record in their left hand behind their backs. So the Quran doesn't go against itself. In another part of the Quran, for example, it says, fear Allah, be conscious of Allah, be aware of Allah. So fear Allah as he ought to be feared. All right? And he ought to be feared. In another part of the Quran, it says, fear Allah as much as you are able. Now, when you put those two together, one meaning is to fear Allah as much as he should be feared is to fear him as much as you are able. Because we're all different. We're all different in our strengths, in our faiths. But you should obviously try to increase your faith and work on strengthening yourself. But you should not willingly go towards sin and immorality. Some of us are weaker than others, but you should fear Allah as much as you should be feared, as much as you are able. So even the angels of the throne, most of them are so afraid they can't even look up above the throne out of fear. So you find out that even the most pious, they're the most God-fearing, like the prophets. They hardly commit sins because they're so afraid of God. So the Quran doesn't go against itself. So when you when you try to interpret a verse, first of all, you have to get the whole Quran, see what's the tone, what's the idea, what's the message of the Quran. Then you have to look at the verse within the context, when that verse was revealed. That's why the Quran wasn't revealed all at once. It was revealed progressively, so that at decreed times, within certain contexts, the verse is sent, and then you can learn how that verse is applied. And then so when you read the Quran, you read a few verses before that, the verse that, for example, they will tell you that the Quran says to kill the disbelievers wherever you find them. It is in the Quran. But the people who say that, they don't tell you what the first two verses are, and they don't tell you what the next two verses are, for example. You know? So the Quran doesn't go against itself. In a part of the Quran, it says, God doesn't prevent you from being kind to those who do not fight you because of religion. All right. So if you can have non-Muslims in the land, and you can ally yourself with them. So in another part, it says, do not ally yourself with disbelievers. So once you realize the Quran doesn't go against itself, then you realize that when the Quran says disbelievers, sometimes it means not just somebody who acknowledges disbelief, but in his actions, it's against belief. They strive towards against the belief. They strive against God and his verses, and they strive against an establishment of God's Sharia on the earth. All right? So do not ally yourself with those people, those who oppress believers or even non-believers, those who aid in the oppression of Muslims. Do not ally yourself with them. Do not befriend those people. But it doesn't prevent you from befriending those who do not fight you because of religion, and those who act justly, because God likes those who act justly. So, obviously, those who are enemies to Islam, they try to lie to the people and try to get them to say the Quran is this and the Quran is that. But when the Quran talks about killing disbelievers wherever you find them, this is in times of war. In times of war, you're fighting against a certain people. All right. So there are verses in the Quran that tell you about before war and after war and during war. For example, when it says, "Strike their necks wherever you find them," or "Strike their necks until you have caused slaughter upon them." This was in battle because there was a time when they were fighting a battle, and then whilst the Muslims were winning, some of the Muslims started taking captives. The battle is still going on and they're taking captives. And God says, like, it's not for a prophet, you know, to take captives at this stage, but it's for him to slaughter the enemies of God until, the war ceases. And when that battle has ended, you can take captives and then you can ransom them or you can free them. And even when they kill a captive, they don't usually kill captives. They even treated nicely, actually. The Quran orders you to give them your food and all that. And some people were giving them their food even though they needed it because, they seek the approval of God. So even your captives, you have to treat them nicely. But for example, if you have an enemy, and let's say you have the generals, and they were ordering things like rape, like you see, even the United Nations has been doing it. They were ordering things like rape and maybe burning people. If you had commanders that were really, really wicked, that were really sinful in their ways, when you capture those people, those commanders you can put to death. So that was done. But once the battle has ended, that particular battle, you can take captives and you can free them, or you can keep them as captives, or you can ransom them. So there are laws about when the battle is going on. And nobody will tell me that during a battle, they're not going to strike the enemy. They're going to strike the enemy. And if your enemy fights against God, then that's worse. Death is the last thing you should worry about. Because in the hereafter, it's going to be a lot worse for you. But most of them don't believe in that anyway, so they're going to enjoy themselves for now. So the Quran has verses that tells you to strike the disbeliever, but most of these things, they've been taken out of context when even by some of the Muslim groups who say they fight jihad. So then they and the disbelievers all use these verses, So like I said before, the end goal of all of them is against Islam, it's to demonize Islam basically. So you have to wonder what jihad they're actually fighting and what's their interest and who's sponsoring these people. Because if you can sanction countries, but yet still groups like ISIS are having the best weapons, then ask yourself why they're having this. Who's giving them these weapons? So while there's a battle, there are guidelines. And you can't, you have to be harsh in battle. What's your battle? You're fighting. And the Muslims should be one body and of government. And every country, most of these countries, they have armies. So of course the Muslims should have armies. All right? Now, talking about apostates, many people and even some Muslims believe that even if somebody just leaves their religion, let's say he doesn't believe anymore in Islam and he believes in, let's say, for example, Christianity, you should kill him. I don't think that's what it's meant. I'm not going to say for sure that it doesn't mean that because so many people believe it means that. And, God knows best what it means. But I believe God is just. And I'll tell you what I think it means, and you'll see I think that it makes sense. So, for example, while there's a war going on against a certain group of people, for example, even during the time of the Prophet, there were hypocrites, people who said they accepted Islam, but just so that they can be spies or they can create trials for the Muslims. So, for example, if they go to battle, they will create doubts in the hearts of the people, They would tell the Muslims not to spend in the cause of God, and to be miserly. So they're basically creating trials for the people. So if somebody had acknowledged faith and then they, for example, killed a Muslim, then that's disbelief. So for example, there was a man who said he was a Muslim and then he was ill, I think. And then a family took care of him. Once he was better, he killed that family. So that was apostasy because he has hurt the Muslim. He has killed a Muslim while he said he was a Muslim. And the punishment for apostates is worse than even for the punishment, for example, for a non-believer who fights Islam. Because When a non-believer fights Islam, for example, like I said, some of the generals who were really wicked in their ways, you give him a quick death because your object is not to punish them. Your object is just to fight for justice and fight for the law of God. And what you can punish him with is nothing compared to what God can punish him with. So you give him a quick death. And as much as people don't like the beheading, that's not a very painful death. If it's done swiftly, not like ISIS where they cut the throat from the front or whatever, then basically it should be pretty much painless. It should be really quick. But the punishment for apostates can be really can be a lot harsher, because actually apostates can cause more harm to the Muslims. So, like I said, once you've hurt Muslims or aid in their killing, then you've committed disbelief. You've apostated, basically. So, if you've claimed Islam, you've claimed to be a Muslim, then you go and plot with the people who fight against the Muslim nation and who fight against establishing God's law on the land, then that's an apostate. And in other countries, in secular countries, they will tell you that's treason. you know, they even have Patriot Acts and all that. You fought against the state. So if you fight against the Muslims or you plot in a plot that would kill Muslims, all right, maybe because you want to be a leader and the secular people have promised you, so you plot against the Muslims and cause their death and you don't care, then you've apostated. Then you can be treated as an apostate. Or if you came and claimed Islam just so that you could get information, then you later went to the disbelievers and you fought with them against Islam, that's apostasy. Then you can be treated as apostate. But if you just think, oh, I don't believe anymore, and you go to something like Christianity or Hinduism, but you don't try to hurt the Muslims, you don't fight against them, you don't fight against the word of God, then you're not really hurting the sovereignty of the state. So that's your personal belief. Maybe God can guide you later, maybe not. And, he has your hereafter as well. To him you'll be returned. So really, that's where my difference in opinion comes as far as apostasy goes. And it makes sense in the Quran when it says that you should kill the apostates, and there are harsher ways that it says you can do it. Because these are people who plotted against the Islamic State. And these are people who maybe were hypocrites. They came and pretended to be Muslims so that they could cause damage. And any intelligent person can see how that can be even more devastating than somebody who fights you outright. Because this person has come spied, he knows your weaknesses, he knows your strengths. He pretended to be one of you, then he went and tried to hurt you. So people, those are some of the things about jihad and some of the verses in the Quran. Like I said, they don't go against each other. So you have to read them within the context. And beware of some of these people who come and talk online, who talk on documentaries, And, just use your reason. So I think that would be it. I just wanted to clear those misconceptions about jihad and all that. And I hope you understand that. Like I say, I want to say it again because it's very important. You have to get the whole tone, the whole message, the whole idea of what the Quran is trying to say. Then you have to get what the context of the verses are. Because the one verse cannot go against the other. And if God has said it doesn't prevent you from taking allies with those who do not fight against you, then obviously it doesn't mean you should kill every disbeliever, even the ones who don't fight against you. So don't be fooled by people's agendas. Use your own reasoning and, search for the truth. So good luck with that. Cheers.